In part 2 of this lecture, we looked at the universal human fears and motivations that can be read into Bram Stoker's Dracula. This video is then going to look at more specific social or political contexts that are also at play in the book. So to kick off, we're going to turn to a Marxist reading of the novel. Many critics have looked at the novel through this critical mode. So to begin with, what is literary Marxism? The Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terminology tells us that it's a tradition of literary and aesthetic interpretation and commentary derived from the principles of Marxism, and thus tending to view literature in the light of modes of production, feudal, capitalist, and their property relations and class struggles. So this is comparable to psychoanalytic literary criticism in that both of these modes see literary critics taking something that was not designed to read novels through, psychoanalysis, which was meant to psychoanalyze human subjects, not books, and Marxism, which was designed to describe social relations around capital and production, and both are applied to literary texts. Now, we've already applied Marx's metaphor of the vampire about capital to Carmilla, when we noted the ways in which the upper class and also women can be read as parasitic or leeches upon society. One example of a Marxist reading of the text comes from someone like Franco Moretti in 1982, where he draws again on this metaphor that Marx uses when he says capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. So Moretti points us to the ways in which growth and production function in the novel, saying, like capital, Dracula is impelled towards a continuous growth, an unlimited expansion of his domain. Accumulation is inherent in his nature. Other critics have read Dracula within a Marxist mode as representing monopolies and corporations, as representing the middle-class businessman, or as representing the new banking industry at the end of the 19th century. But what's central to all of these is this focus on the kind of modes of production and the way in which capital is circulating within the novel. Someone like Daniel Pick, on the other hand, focuses on the scientific context of the late 19th century and reads Dracula as responding to fears of species degeneration, which come to the fore with the burgeoning field of criminology. So Mina at one point invokes the theories of Lombroso, who suggested that it was possible to recognize the born criminal by their facial features. Pick therefore argues that Dracula picks up on a social moral panic about the reproduction of degeneration, the poisoning of good bodies and races by bad blood, and the vitiation of healthy procreation. Obviously, blood is extremely central to a vampire novel, but there are a lot of worries about mixing blood within Mina, for instance, when she becomes unclean, and bad blood spreading. So it's really important that the novel ends with Mina becoming a mother, and Jonathan has that quite weird moment where he suggests that sort of all of them are the fathers of this baby, because that's good blood, particularly good middle-class British blood, winning out over the bad blood, the foreign, the aristocratic blood that Dracula put into Mina. It's very clear that Stoker is engaged with Lombroso when he's writing this book, not just because Mina mentions Lombroso by name, but in the description of Dracula. So Lombroso, who suggested that being a criminal was a biological trait, that you could be a born criminal through bad blood, through bad inheritance, but that you could recognize a criminal by their facial features. And he gave a number of different descriptions showing it's not just you're a criminal, but you can recognize the kind of criminal someone was. And his description of the habitual murderer very clearly matches with the description of Dracula that Stoker gives us. So the habitual murderer has a cold stare, glassy, bloodshot eyes, a hawk-like nose, strong jaw, broad cheekbones, dark and abundant hair, developed canine teeth, and thin lips. And this is very much the description we get of Dracula when Harker first arrives at the castle. Had he been a bit more up on his Lombroso, he would have known to get out immediately. Mina has been reading Lombroso, but Jonathan hasn't, so she possesses the knowledge and authority to diagnose Dracula for what he is, where poor Harker doesn't have that knowledge. So we can see the novel's been interpreted in a lot of different ways and through a lot of different contexts. And probably most commonly, actually, the novel's interpreted not as being about sex or criminality or money, but about engaging with issues of colonialism and immigration. So, as a critical mode, post-colonial theory considers vexed cultural political questions of national and ethnic identity, otherness, race, imperialism, and language during and after the colonial periods. It draws upon post-structuralist theories such as those of deconstruction in order to unravel the complex relations between imperial center and colonial periphery. We've already seen some of this criticism going on when we looked at Wuthering Heights and also Carmilla. So obviously Wuthering Heights, through the figure of Heathcliff and his racial otherness, engages a lot of ideas about colonialism. And in Carmilla, we see the kind of stubborn Britishness of Laura's household, the way her father, even in Styria, insists on maintaining the supremacy of Britain. He's sort of colonizing a very small patch of another country in making it into an English territory and coming into conflict then with the local and the native. So Stephen Arata, who we've seen before in the previous videos, included Dracula as an example of novels of what he termed reverse colonization. Arata writes, "Moments like this recur with remarkable frequency in late Victorian popular fiction, embedded in what can be called narratives of reverse colonization. In such narratives, what has been represented as the civilized world is on the point of being overrun by primitive forces. In each case, a fearful reversal occurs. The colonizer finds himself in the position of the colonized. The exploiter is exploited. The victimizer victimized. The reversals are in turn linked to perceived problems, racial, moral, spiritual, within Great Britain itself. Yet, if fantasies of reverse colonization are products of the geopolitical fears of a troubled imperial society, they are also responses to cultural guilt. In the marauding, invasive other, British culture sees its own imperial practice mirrored back in monstrous forms. Stoker's Count Dracula and Haggard's Asha frighten not least because their characteristic actions, appropriation and exploitation, uncannily reproduce those of the colonizing Englishman." Arata positions Dracula within a wave of other novels that come towards the end of the Victorian period that enact the same basic plotline. Foreign bodies from abroad, particularly from lands that have been colonized by the British, return to England or threaten to return to England and take over. So we see here fears that the empire can't sustain itself and that new, stronger powers are going to rise up around it and potentially be able to colonize Britain the way Britain has colonized the rest of the world. And so Arata points to novels like H. Rider Haggard's She, H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, in which the stronger, the more intelligent and the more technologically advanced Martian society comes to Earth and is quite easily able to wipe out humanity, or books like Pharaoh the Egyptian or The Riddle of the Sands, which engage with the kind of quite insidious colonization that's happening in Egypt at the time, at the end of the 19th century. These readings keep Dracula incredibly relevant today. These are relevant to debates about freedom of movement and immigration in Britain in the 21st century. It's that same fear that immigrants will come and take what is rightfully British. In the novel, that's represented by women, but you can see it in the rhetoric that comes out of the far right in Britain today, talking about immigrants coming and stealing our jobs or taking council housing or using benefits that should be spent on real British people. All of this is the same idea that while we, the West, went over there and exploited their natural resources, exploited the people there, took what we wanted, that now in turn they will be able to come here and take back some of those resources. So it's this fear of reciprocity, basically, that the power balance will be inverted and suddenly they will be able to take from us the way we took from them. And as we could see in that final bit of Arata's quotation, focusing on the mirroring in monstrous form of the colonizing Englishman, this idea focuses on doubling. The reverse colonial reenacts the worst actions of colonialism upon the colonizer. So the fear is not that so-called savages are so different from so-called civilized Brits, but actually that they are the same, and thus that they will treat the British with exactly the same lack of mercy that the British treated their own colonial subjects. And we can see a lot of this at play in the way in which Jonathan goes out to Transylvania and the way in which Dracula comes into England. Jonathan's very much convinced of his own superiority. We can see this in the way he talks about trains, and the trains don't run to time the further east he gets, and also the way he talks about superstitions. The woman in the inn is entirely correct that he is about to foolishly blunder into the castle of a vampire when she gives him the crucifix, but Jonathan assumes that his British culture and British knowledge is superior to hers, even though hers is local and specific knowledge. And so he ignores her warnings, he laughs at her superstitions. He goes in assuming mastery over the situation. And then what he finds instead is that rather than all of the people he encounters in Transylvania being like that peasant woman, silly and superstitious, again, though she was correct, what he finds is someone who is too much like him. Dracula would make a very good lawyer, Jonathan says. Dracula knows all about keeping trains to time and timetables. He knows all about England. He knows all about business. He knows all about the law. He is too much like Jonathan and is therefore able to both take over Jonathan's own life. He impersonates him in writing and sending letters, but also is able to come into England and use its laws and social norms in order to get ahead. And so the way in which cultural supremacy functions in the novel, the assumption of being better than the other, means that you underestimate them, which is a very, very dangerous thing to do. And that's what leads to all the problems that Jonathan has. By the end of the novel, the most important thing is that Mina acknowledges just how intelligent Dracula is. She has to reckon with him as an equal in order to defeat him. So what's interesting about considering all these different critical readings of the text is that they all are simultaneously at play in the book. The empire is very conspicuously there. Money is very conspicuously there. Sex is very conspicuously there, both in what is allowed and what isn't allowed, both in what's expressed and what's repressed. Newspaper culture and print culture is very much there. Women's rights and education are very much circulating within the text. All of these are at play along with many, many more because of the way the Gothic constructs its monsters. They can sort of absorb all kinds of social contexts and, as I said, have new ones projected upon them as they move through time. And this is what makes the Gothic both potentially frustrating as you sit down to write essays, and there is no one meaning, there is no correct answer, but also really exciting and really fluid and adaptable, keeping them popular, keeping them current throughout centuries.